In the heart of Florida's mysterious Everglades, officers uncover something that was never meant to be found: a rusted submarine buried beneath the swamp. What they discover inside will break your heart and change everything you thought you knew. Stay with us to the end, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to support the channel. The Everglades breathed in long, humid sighs, an endless quilt of green and gray stitched with thin black seams of water. Heat rose off the shallows in wavering sheets, and the drone of insects braided itself into a constant, narcotic hum. Officer Linda Clark steered the patrol skiff along a narrow channel, knuckles pale on the tiller, eyes cutting from cattail to cypress stump to the broken mirrors of sky trembling on the surface. It was the kind of day when everything seemed to hover light, air and attention, waiting for a reason to drop. Beside her, Sergeant Thomas Reed raised a pair of salt-pocked binoculars and scanned the horizon, silhouette carved against a bank of summer thunderheads. "Same as yesterday," he said, not lowering the glasses. "Traps, coolers, beer cans, the usual trophies of people who think the swamp is a closet." "Let's hope it's a quiet run," Linda murmured. The outboard ticked and droned. A great blue heron lifted out of the reeds like a careful thought and drifted down a corridor of mangroves. They had been out for hours, tracing a slow figure eight through a spread of ponds connected by dark, vein-like cuts of water. The skiff's hull whispered against sawgrass. Once, they nosed up to a half-sunk styrofoam cooler, Reed plucking it with a boathook and flipping the lid with a practiced flick. Empty. Linda logged the coordinates anyway, more out of habit than hope. She let the motor idle as they passed a raft of lilies-wide lacquered pads marbled with shadow, when something winked from below. A flick of unnatural light, quick as a blink. She frowned and eased back on the throttle. The skiff glided, heat crinkled. The glint did not return. "Tom," she said, voice flat but tight. "Hold a second." Reed swept the area with the binoculars, then dropped them and leaned forward, as if he could bully the water into clarity. "What is it?" "I saw metal." Linda angled the bow. The light came again, fainter this time, as the sun snagged some submerged curve exactly right. Not a can, not an anchor. Wrong color, wrong shape. Smooth, deliberate. Reed reached for the push-pole and stood, bare forearm pressed to the gunnel for balance. He prodded the water between lily pads, feeling for bottom. The tip found resistance with a soft, dulled chime that traveled up the pole into bone. Not wood. Not rock. Metal. "Not junk," he said, meeting her eyes. Doubt, then interest, then something watchful passing through his expression. He probed again, mapping edges they could not yet see. "It's solid. Big enough to matter." Linda thumbed the radio and called in their position, keeping her voice deliberately casual. Request for a secondary unit. Possible submerged debris. Hazard to navigation. While she spoke, the air shifted, and a skin of cloud slid over the sun, sucking the color out of everything. The heron was gone. Even the insects seemed to notch down a register. "Let's mark it," Reed said. He tied a strip of orange flagging to the push-pole and sank it until the tape wrinkled at the surface. The skiff rocked once, and a ring of oily bubbles surfaced and broke, leaving behind a breath of something stale and mineral that did not belong to the living swamp. They waited. The channel narrowed its voice around them. The second boat arrived first, then the rescue team's aluminum rig with twin outboards and a steel A-frame that looked, out here, as alien as a city skyline. The divers briefed in low voices while Linda and Reed outlined what they'd seen. A man with a gray mustache checked the current with a pinch of grass and a squint. "Visibility?" one diver asked. "On a good day," the mustache said. Bad. They did not bother with jokes after that. Wetsuits hissed. Tanks clinked. Reed watched Linda watch the water. She had gone still in a way he recognized. Not afraid, exactly, but listening with all the parts of herself she trusted most. The swamp had different rules than the road. It told you things first with temperature, and then with smell, and only at the end, with sound. The divers slipped over the side. The water took them without ripple, swallowing their fins, their masks, then the trembling line of their bubbles. Minutes extended, turning from elastic to brittle. Reed glanced at his watch, and then, because he could not help himself, at the pole's orange flag. It fluttered and stilled. The cloud cover thickened until afternoon resembled early evening. One diver surfaced alone, wrenching back his regulator. His eyes, when they found Linda's, had the preoccupied focus of someone rearranging the world to fit a new fact. It's a hull, he said, breath spooling white despite the heat. Curved. Steel, looks like. A beat. Rounded nose. Small. Boat? Reed asked. The diver shook his head. Not like any skiff I've seen. More like, I don't know, a capsule. He looked back toward the flag, as if the rest of his sentence was still down there. There's a seam along the top, like a hatch. Silence thinned around the boats. Linda felt the skiff's planks under her boots, as if they had become more real to counterbalance what she had just heard. She swallowed. Can you rig it? We can try. They dropped a grapnel and sent it testing into the weeds. Twice it skipped off. The third time it held, the diver below guiding it by feel. Slings followed, threaded under with hands and blunted knives, then cinched to the A-frame. The winch cable whined. The swamp's skin bulged, hesitated, split. Mud boiled up in a black-brown plume that smelled like a cellar no one had opened in years. It rose, a curve first, scalloped with barnacle and weed, then a longer back, and at last the suggestion of a blunt, staring face. The men on the rig did not cheer. There was nothing in the shape that invited relief. Even camouflaged by algae, it was too deliberate, too ungainly to be a natural thing or an accident. A small, rust-streaked body with a spine of welded seams and a cracked circular viewport like a blind eye. Not a boat. Not a barrel. Something between. They nursed it to the surface. The slings creaked. Water sheeted off its flanks in green veils and ran back into the channel, carrying threads of black silt. The hull was no longer than a panel van, and narrower, but heavier than its size suggested. Along the top, just offset from centerline, a low hump ended in a ring of bolts, and a frozen lock fused by corrosion into a solid, ugly bloom. The hatch seam the diver had felt below looked now like a rough crescent, cut into a single thought. "Get it to shore," Reed said, voice blunt to hide the notch of awe. They eased it onto a raft of lily pads that flattened under its weight. Then, foot by slow foot, coaxed it toward a muddy shoulder where a half-submerged cypress knelt like a sentry. Hands in gloves, ropes through cleats, everyone talking just loudly enough for no one to say the wrong thing. The swamp allowed it, tolerant for now, giving up one of its tenants reluctantly, as if returning a book no one had checked out. When the hull settled on mud, the team stepped back and looked at it without words. It had that quality certain human-made things get when built under duress. Purpose hammered into shape by necessity, not elegance. Steel plates overlapped in awkward marriages, bead welds blistered and meandering. Here and there, a borrowed life. The stub of a boat cleat, the outline of a fuel cap, a pair of mismatched hinges that suggested a builder who knew metal, but not the luxury of time. A mechanic in a sweat-dark cap ran a hand along a seam and hissed when orange rust filmed his skin. "Not factory," he said needlessly. Not even yard-built. This is somebody's garage turned inside out. Who builds a sub in a garage? Another asked, his attempt at a laugh cracking. No one answered. The sky weighed lower. Linda circled the nose and stopped at the cracked viewport. No glass left, only a spiderweb of mineral and film. She crouched, careful not to touch, and peered as far as light would let her. Nothing back there yet, but darkness and an impression of closeness that tugged at the throat. She stood and shut her eyes until the vertigo passed. "Let's log what we can see," Reed told her softly, as if loudness might wake the thing. They took photos, the hatch, the lock bloom, a string of digits scratched into the metal with something sharper than a nail. The numbers had the hesitant spacing of a hand that did not write often, but didn't want to forget. She copied them into her notebook, each digit sounding in her head with the small weight of a pebble added to a pocket. "Could be a hazard to leave overnight," the mustached rescue lead said. "Curiosity brings bad company." "We'll post a unit," Reed said, already thinking in concentric circles of tape and cones. "We're not opening anything tonight." The decision should have lifted something, but it did not. The swamp had grown very quiet. In that hush, small sounds had the outline of shouts, a drip from the A-frame, the skiff's bow line nudging a cleat, the distant pop of a frog. Linda found herself glancing over her shoulder, as if someone had joined them who preferred to stand just out of sight. A field light came off the rescue rig and bloomed white against the hull, bleaching the green to chalk. Under it, details emerged that daylight had flattened. The ripples where heat had made the steel buckle slightly, the signature of a hand that had learned welding too quickly. The mechanic with the cap tapped a lug with a knuckle. "Lock's fused. If you're set on getting in, you'll need to cut." "Tomorrow," Reed repeated. "We do it proper, controlled, with forensics and someone who signs my paycheck watching." The men began to move the way they do when a day is decided to end without permission. Tools returned to bins, ropes coiled into sleeping snakes. A diver, still wet, took a swig from a bottle and swallowed with a face like a man trying to forget a flavor. The light kept hissing. Linda stayed where she was a moment longer, close enough to feel the radiated cool of the steel. She had the thought, unwelcome and unreasonable, that the shape on the mud was less like a machine and more like something the swamp had grown around to protect, or to quarantine. She wrote the word hatch in her notebook and underlined it twice, then closed the book with her thumb inside, as if the pressure could keep the day from spilling into the next. "Let's get the perimeter set," Reed said behind her. His voice had regained its ordinary hardness, but there was a space in the middle of it that had not been there at dawn. By the time the secondary unit arrived with barricade tape and collapsible cones, the light had gone the melancholy color of wet iron. They strung a bright ribbon around dark metal and told themselves it changed anything. Reed signed a chain of custody form on the tailgate of a truck, the paper gone soft with humidity. The mustached lid nodded at the hatch, as if it were a person whose name he had forgotten. "You ever see anything like this?" he asked Linda, not really expecting yes. "No," she said, "and I don't think the swamp has either." He snorted, not unkindly, and climbed into the rig. When at last the engines dwindled and the last wake erased itself on the grass, the small camp they had raised around the hull felt provisional, like a temporary treaty. A pair of floodlights threw crude shadows of cypress knees across the mud. Mosquitoes, undeterred by tape or authority, found the skin between glove and sleeve and left their welts there. A night heron called once, a falling note that made the light seem colder. Linda and Reed stood together and studied the hatch again, the way people stare at a door that dares them to knock. He jammed his hands into his pockets. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she echoed. and heard in her own voice the admission that tonight would be long. They left a two-person watch at the tape line, Ranger Morales and Deputy Finch, both reliable, both vaccinated by boredom against the fever of imagination, and pushed the skiff off with a creak. As Linda settled behind the tiller, she glanced back. The floodlights made the hull a crude monument, the hatch seam a closed eyelid. For a moment, the cracked viewport caught and fractured the light into a tired sparkle, and then it went dull again, as if it had decided to wait. The channel accepted them, and the skiff's wake scribbled softly until the water smoothed it into forgetting. Behind them, the swamp resumed its measured breathing. Ahead, low lightning stitched pale threads inside the bellies of clouds. "Think it's what it looks like?" Reed asked into the wind, half a question, half a dare. "I don't know what it looks like," Linda said. She fixed the bow between two dark smudges of mangrove and felt the motor's small vibration climb through her heel to her spine. "But it doesn't look like it belongs." They didn't speak after that. The swamp preferred them quiet. By the time the dock emerged, blunt and ordinary, the hush had stored itself inside Linda's chest like a weather change that would not arrive until morning. Back at the station, she rinsed mud from the skiff in the yellow wash of a sodium lamp and wrote the day's report while the water drummed the hull. She kept the sentences short. Location, time, depth estimate, dimensions observed, actions taken. It read like a map of a place you could not yet draw. At the bottom, she left a blank line where hatch opened would one day go, then capped her pen and slid the notebook into her locker as if she were tucking in a restless child. On the drive home, the road shouldered up out of the wet world, and the air changed, drier, duller, less alive. Yet the image rode with her, the rounded back rising, the lock's iron bloom, the numbers scratched by a hand that had meant for them to be found or not found, and could no longer say which. When she closed her eyes to sleep, they were still there, insisting on their own gravity. She dreamed of a door she would open, and of a breath that had been waiting for years to leave. At first light, the swamp would give them the rest of its sentence, but tonight it held the period. Out there, under the hiss of floodlights and the combing of mist, the sealed seam kept its counsel. The hatch did not move. The air around it thickened barely at all, as if holding on to a story, until someone with the right voice asked. Morning was coming. So was the cutting torch, the camera, the numbered flags, and the words to follow. For now, the Everglades lay with its secret half-raised and listening, and the officers who had disturbed it lay awake, listening back. By morning, a heavy mist draped the Everglades like a shroud, muffling sound and turning distance into gray silence. The swamp that yesterday had shimmered with heat now looked almost spectral. Linda Clark arrived at the site just after sunrise, her boots sinking into the damp earth. The small submarine rested on a tarp near the shore, its rusted hull streaked with brown and green, beads of dew glistening along the seams like sweat. The floodlights from the night before still buzzed faintly, their pale glow cutting through the fog. She had barely slept. The image of the thing emerging from the dark water haunted her dreams, a coffin dragged out of the mud, holding something the world had forgotten. She found Sergeant Reed already there, coffee cup in hand, eyes fixed on the sealed hatch. His face looked drawn, the skin around his mouth pale from too much thinking and too little rest. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," she replied. "Any movement?" He shook his head. "Nothing. It's dead quiet. Feels like the swamp's holding its breath." She nodded toward the forensic team setting up equipment, cameras, evidence markers, sealed bags. The air smelled of rust and fuel, Every sound seemed swallowed by the mist, as though the world itself didn't want to be part of what was coming. The hatch loomed in front of them, circular and fused shut by years of corrosion. One of the engineers, a tall man named Harlan, crouched beside it with a cutting torch. "We can try to open it clean," he said, testing the pressure on the lock, "but the metal's fused from the inside. Whoever sealed this thing didn't want it opened again." Reed exhaled slowly. "Do it." The torch hissed to life, its blue flame slicing through the damp air. Sparks scattered across the metal like fireflies before dying on the wet ground. The sound of burning steel filled the swamp, unnatural, jarring. Linda stepped back, shielding her face from the heat. It smelled like scorched earth and something else, a sour, stale odor rising from within. Minutes passed. The saw bit through the thick lock, one layer after another, until at last the hatch gave a low groan, a deep, hollow sound that made everyone flinch. Harlan turned off the torch and stood back. Steam curled around the seams. "It's loose," he said. Reed and Linda exchanged a glance. "Let's do it," she said. They braced themselves and pulled together, the hinges shrieking in protest. The hatch cracked open an inch, and a rush of foul, stagnant air burst out, reeking of decay and time. Everyone instinctively stepped back, covering their faces. Even the insects seemed to pause. Linda swallowed hard. "God!" Reed's voice was low. "Get lights inside." A floodlight was positioned, and its beam cut through the opening. The interior appeared as a narrow tunnel of rusted metal and collapsed pipes. Wires hung from the ceiling like vines. The air shimmered with moisture. No one spoke for a moment. Then Harlan climbed the short ladder, leaning into the opening with his flashlight. He froze. "You're going to want to see this." Linda joined him. As her light pierced the darkness, her breath caught in her throat. The interior was cramped, barely enough room for two people to sit. On the far wall, slumped against the controls, was a human figure. The shape of the skull was unmistakable, the bones gray and slick with condensation. Nearby, another figure sat by the hatch, knees drawn up, as if frozen mid-motion, the last act of someone trying to escape. "Jesus," Reed whispered behind her. The silence deepened, heavy and fragile. Linda stepped carefully inside, the metal floor creaking under her weight. The smell of rot was overpowering, thick with age. The walls dripped with moisture, streaked with mold and oil. Every surface looked eaten alive by time. She raised her flashlight higher, tracing the outlines of what had once been an instrument panel. Makeshift controls patched together with wires, switches from different machines, and a broken navigation screen. Evidence of desperation rather than expertise. Whoever built this didn't have a workshop. They had fear and a deadline. The body at the controls had one arm extended toward a panel, fingers still curled around a lever. Beside him, a small leather wallet sat half-buried in grime. Linda crouched, gloved fingers trembling slightly as she lifted it. Inside were 2 ID cards, faded and damp, but still readable. "Michael Delgado," she read aloud, her voice soft in the confined space. "And Anthony Delgado, both from Miami." Reed exhaled. "Brothers." Linda looked again at the remains. The one by the controls, older, larger, must have been Michael. The younger, near the hatch, Anthony. The realization hit her like a slow punch to the chest. This wasn't just another smuggling wreck. It was personal. A shout came from outside. "Lieutenant, you'd better see this." They climbed out, blinking against the gray light. A forensic tech was kneeling by the tarp, holding something in his gloved hand. A small, plastic-sealed photograph, warped but intact. Inside the sleeve was a picture of a little girl with pigtails, smiling wide at the camera. The edges were worn from being held too often. "Found it in the pilot's hand," the tech said. Linda took it carefully, her stomach tightening. The girl looked maybe 6, happy, unaware of anything beyond the moment the picture was taken. "She's his daughter," Linda murmured. Reed nodded slowly. "Michael Delgado probably carried it with him the whole time." The swamp seemed to listen again. No birds, no wind, just the faint hiss of the torch cooling beside them. Linda turned back toward the submarine, her reflection faintly visible on the rusted surface. "They died in there," she said softly. "Trapped." Reed looked down at the hatch. "Looks like one tried to get out. Maybe they lost power." The forensic team began taking samples, measuring, documenting everything. The air was thick with unspoken emotion, fascination, horror, pity. "Back the evidence," Reed instructed, his voice distant. "We'll bring the bodies to the coroner's lab." Linda stayed by the sub as they worked, her mind spiraling around what she'd seen. The inside had felt too deliberate, not like a cartel operation, but like something built in secret, with care. Someone had planned to survive down there, not die. Hours later, as the first drops of rain began to fall, they finally closed the hatch again. The tarp flapped in the wind, covering the small, rusted vessel like a shroud. The swamp was dark now, thunder murmuring in the distance. When they loaded the submarine onto a flatbed truck, Linda watched silently. The headlights cut across the clearing, flashing over the hull as it disappeared into the rain. The air felt heavier, the kind of weight that presses on the chest and doesn't lift easily. Reed came to stand beside her. "We'll know more after the autopsy. Probably just a smuggling op gone bad," he said, trying for certainty. "Maybe," she said. Her eyes never left the road where the truck had vanished. "But it doesn't feel like that." Reed looked at her. "What do you mean?" She shook her head. "The way it was built, the markings, that picture." She hesitated. It felt human, like someone trying to hide something personal, not just drugs. Reed sighed, brushing rain from his face. "We'll see what the evidence says." Linda didn't answer. Her thoughts stayed in the dark cabin, with 2 men who'd run out of air and hope. She imagined them realizing the hatch wouldn't open, the panic, the silence after. As the last of the crew packed up, lightning split the horizon. For a brief second, the swamp was alive again. Trees flashing silver, the water turning to glass. Then it was gone, replaced by the endless, pulsing hum of the Everglades. Linda stood there until the rain became steady, washing the mud from her boots, from her hands, but not from her mind. She knew sleep wouldn't come that night. The faces, or what was left of them, would follow her home. Before leaving, she took one last look at the spot where the sub had rested. The earth there was flattened, darker than the surrounding mud. As thunder rolled again, she whispered under her breath, "We'll find out who you were." Reed called her from the car, and she turned away. The beam from the floodlight caught the mist as she walked, breaking into 1,000 fragments that vanished as soon as she passed through them. The swamp returned to silence, as if swallowing what had happened, but the air still held a faint, metallic echo. The memory of the hatch creaking open for the first time in years. And somewhere, far beneath that silence, something old and sorrowful seemed to breathe again. The Everglades had given up one of its secrets, but Linda could feel it in her bones. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The drive to Miami stretched beneath a washed-out sky, a pale blue that never seemed to settle. The highway cut through miles of sawgrass and low water, and even at 70 miles an hour, the swamp still felt close. Breathing, watching. Linda Clark sat in silence beside Sergeant Reed, her thoughts caught somewhere between what they had seen inside the sub and what waited ahead. The hum of the tires and the low murmur of the radio were the only sounds in the car. The night before had offered little rest. She had dreamed of metal walls closing in, of air thinning until it tasted like iron. The image of the two bodies still lingered. The older man's hand gripping the photo of a little girl, the younger one curled by the hatch. It wasn't the sight of death that haunted her. It was the story behind it, the choices that had led them there. They reached Miami by mid-morning. The city's pulse felt foreign after the stillness of the Everglades. Traffic, voices, sirens, all layered into a rhythm that never stopped. Reed pulled into a cracked parking lot outside an old apartment complex that leaned slightly toward the street. The walls were faded yellow, streaked by years of rain. According to the records, this was the last known address of the Delgado brothers. They climbed the narrow stairwell to the second floor. The hallway smelled of bleach and mildew. A woman with graying hair and tired eyes opened the door at the end. She wore a faded housecoat and looked like someone who had been woken too many times by bad news. "Mrs. Alvarez?" Linda asked. The woman nodded. "You're the police?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm Officer Clark. This is Sergeant Reed. We're looking for information about Michael and Anthony Delgado." The name alone changed her expression. She blinked hard and leaned against the doorframe. "Michael and Anthony. Dios mío, it's been years. I thought something must have happened." "When was the last time you saw them?" Reed asked gently. Mrs. Alvarez looked past them toward the hallway, as if searching her memory in the peeling paint. "After their mother died," she said finally. "They stayed here a few months. Then one day, they packed up everything and left. Said they were going north for work. They never came back. Were they in trouble? Anyone looking for them?" Linda asked. She shook her head. No. They were good boys, always helping around the building. Michael fixed my washing machine twice. Anthony would help carry groceries for the old tenants. But after their mother passed, Michael changed. He had a little girl, you know. Emily. She was maybe 5 then. Sweet child. Linda exchanged a quick glance with Reed. "Do you know what happened to her?" Mrs. Alvarez hesitated. "After they left, Emily stayed with her aunt, Rosa Delgado. She lives in Hialeah, I think. Poor thing. Her father promised he'd come back for her." "Did he say where he was going?" Reed pressed. "No," Mrs. Alvarez said softly. "Only that he'd found a job that could change everything." The words hung there like a faint echo of hope that had died long ago. Linda thanked the woman and handed her a card. As they walked down the steps, the noise of the street rose again. A bus braking, children shouting, life moving on, untouched by the story that had ended in the swamp. "Rosa Delgado," Reed said, sliding behind the wheel. "Let's pay her a visit." Hialeah was quieter, older, narrow streets lined with pastel houses, each yard fenced by chain link and crowned with bougainvillea. They found the address easily, a modest single-story home with faded blue shutters and an overgrown garden. A dog barked somewhere inside. A woman in her 50s answered the door, a folded dish towel in her hands. Her dark eyes flicked between them, wary but polite. "Mrs. Delgado," Linda began, "we're here about your nephews, Michael and Anthony." The towel fell from Rosa's hands. She covered her mouth, eyes filling with tears. "You found them," she whispered, "after all this time?" Linda nodded gently. "We did." Rosa led them inside. The living room was small, filled with the smell of coffee and old wood. Photographs lined the walls, family gatherings, birthdays, faded memories. She motioned for them to sit. Her hands trembled as she poured coffee into chipped cups. "Please," she said, "tell me." Linda hesitated. "We found a vessel, a small homemade submersible, in the Everglades. Inside were 2 men. We identified them as Michael and Anthony Delgado." Rosa's eyes closed. A long, broken breath escaped her. For a moment she said nothing, then whispered, "I always knew something went wrong." Do you know what they were doing out there? Reed asked carefully. Rosa sat down across from them, fingers tightening around her cup. After their mother died, everything fell apart. Michael couldn't afford the bills. The shop where they worked closed down. He tried. God knows he tried. But there was never enough. And he had Emily. He loved that girl more than his own life. She looked toward a small framed picture on the mantel, a man in greasy overalls, smiling beside a younger boy holding a wrench. Both of them beamed with pride in front of a half-finished boat. Michael was a mechanic, Rosa continued. So was Anthony. They could build anything if you gave them the parts. One day, Michael told me he'd met someone, a man who could help. Said there was work building something big. Dangerous, but it would pay enough to clear his debts. I begged him not to go. What was the man's name? Linda asked. Rosa's eyes darkened. Ricardo Moreno. That's all I know. Michael said he was from Tampa. Reed and Linda exchanged a look. That name wasn't new. They'd both heard it whispered in old narcotics reports. A mid-level smuggler who vanished after a DEA raid years ago. Did Michael ever tell you what kind of work it was? Reed asked. Rosa shook her head. He said it was a boat job, custom design. He didn't want me to worry. He promised it was only for a few weeks, just enough to get Emily into a better school. But then he stopped calling. The last letter I got said, "If this works, we'll finally be free." Linda listened, every word cutting a little deeper. She could picture him, a man at the edge of desperation, holding on to the illusion that one last gamble could save his family. Rosa stood and went to the closet. She returned with a small box, setting it on the table. Inside were old letters, a mechanic's license, and several photographs. She lifted one and handed it to Linda. It showed Michael and Anthony standing beside a rough wooden frame, the early skeleton of a small vessel. Their faces were sunburned, their smiles bright and naive. He built things his whole life, Rosa said softly. Boats, engines, whatever kept food on the table. If he made that submarine, I know he didn't mean it for evil. Maybe he thought it was just another job. Linda turned the photo over. Written on the back, in faint pencil, were the words, "For Emily, so she'll never go hungry." The silence in the room deepened. Outside, the sound of a lawnmower drifted faintly, ordinary and distant. Reed cleared his throat. "Do you still have contact with Emily?" Rosa nodded. "She's with a foster family now, outside Tampa. I visit when I can. She's grown so much." Linda felt a heaviness settle in her chest. The little girl from the photograph, the one whose father had died clutching her picture, was still out there, unaware of what had happened beneath the swamp. When they finally stood to leave, Rosa followed them to the door. "Please," she said quietly, "tell her he wasn't a bad man." Linda met her eyes. "I will." Back in the car, the weight of what they had learned hung between them. The Delgado brothers weren't smugglers. They were workers, mechanics, men who had tried to save their family and lost everything in the attempt. Reed started the engine but didn't pull away immediately. "Ricardo Moreno," he said. "That's the key. We find him. We find the truth." Linda nodded, watching the houses pass by as they drove off. The city blurred into motion, but her mind stayed behind, in that small living room where a woman still waited for closure, and a child's photo sat on a dusty mantel. For the first time since the swamp, Linda felt the story taking shape. The submarine, the brothers, the picture, all pieces of something larger. And somewhere in that picture was a man named Moreno, the thread that tied it all together. As the sun began to set over the Miami skyline, painting the city in bruised orange light, Linda whispered to herself. They weren't criminals. They were fathers, sons, brothers. Reed glanced at her, but said nothing. He didn't need to. They both knew this wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was a promise, one Linda intended to keep. The Everglades had given up its dead, but their story was still buried. And now, she was determined to dig until she reached the truth, no matter how deep it lay. By the time Linda reached the federal impound, the light outside had thinned to a washed steel. Inside the hangar, fluorescence hummed and made everything look too clean. Tables in rows, evidence flags like small, obedient flames, the submarine torn open in careful pieces. It was strange how much more human the thing had seemed on the mud. Disassembled, it looked like an argument laid out part by part, waiting for someone to read it correctly. An engineer in a grease-stained lab coat name tag, B. Keller, met her at the door with a clipboard and an expression that had no room left for speculation. Reed arrived a breath behind her, coffee in one hand, pen in the other. "You're just in time," Keller said, motioning them toward a table where a jury of parts waited. Intake piping, a dented canister, a valve assembly the size of a fist, stripped of paint and personality. "We think we've found your failure." He tapped the valve with the back of a pen. The pen sounded a dry, hollow note. "Intake system for the air mix. Whoever built it reused hardware that wasn't rated for sustained pressure. Here." He pointed to a fine hairline along the valve's throat, no more than a thread of shadow. "Microfracture. The weld along this seam was rushed. Under load, that hairline propagated." He shifted the piece so the light caught the flaw. The crack blinked back, undeniable now that it had been named. When the pressure spiked, the valve deformed. The seal failed. "How fast?" Reed asked. "Fast enough," Keller said. "They'd have noticed the mix go wrong right away. Taste of metal, headache blooming behind the eyes, and then water." He turned, indicating a corroded Y-junction. "This joint shows intrusion. Not catastrophic at first, a leak the size of a thread. But once the pressure curve moved, it would climb. Think of it like a zipper that someone pulled without meaning to." Linda stared at the line of failure and saw, without choosing to, the interior of the hole as she had first seen it. Metal sweating, breath souring, a body at the controls refusing to quit. So the air went bad, then the water came. "And the clock started," Keller said. He set the valve down gently, as if the story inside it could still bruise. On another table, a section of the hatch was braced open like a jaw. The inner mechanism had been cut to expose the lockwork, a set of mismatched bolts, a scavenged latch plate. Keller's colleague, a compact woman with safety glasses pushed into her hair, joined them. "Sasha Ito," she said, offering a blue-gloved hand. "Hatch analysis. You said one of the men was found by the door?" "The younger," Linda answered. "Anthony." Ito nodded. "He tried to open it. You can see along the interior handle. These bright scours are new relative to the rest. He torqued it hard. But the locking lug, here." She touched a dull bump with a gloved fingertip. It was heat-warped. The metal swelled just enough to bind against the ring. From the outside, you cut through corrosion. From the inside, he was fighting geometry. "Could they have forced it?" Reed asked. "Not without a pry bar and a better angle. And even then, with pressure on the other side? Unlikely." She tapped a set of scratches radiating from the handle, like a spray of tiny white rivers. "He slipped." More than once. The words arrayed themselves with clinical calm, but the picture they formed was anything but. Linda looked from hatch to valve and back to the gutted control panel on a third table. Somebody, two somebodies, had mapped their way from problem to problem inside a closed sentence and then run out of punctuation. "What about the mix?" Reed asked. "Any trace?" "We've got residue," Keller said. "Enough to tell oxygen delivery was dropping below safe percentages before the waterline rose, That's consistent with this." He patted the valve. They weren't just drowning. They were suffocating. Linda closed her eyes for a second and found the seam of her breath. When she opened them, she forced herself to look, not at the parts now, but at what the parts implied. "How long?" she asked. "From first failure to the end." Keller glanced at Ito. Ito lifted a shoulder. "It's a reconstruction," she said. "But if the leak started as small as we think, and the mix slipped when it did, they had maybe 20 minutes of fight. A narrow window where choices still mattered. After that, the choices would have thinned to reflex." "And in that window," Reed said, voice a little rough, "Michael wrote a note." The evidence tech on duty set a sealed bag on the table with the care one reserves for objects that are both fragile and unbearably heavy. The paper inside was pocked and warped. The ink bloomed where the water had licked it. Linda already knew what it said. She had read the words the day before, felt them land in her hands like a small, stubborn heart. "If anyone finds this, forgive us." The engine failed. We tried to surface. "Tell my daughter Emily I love her." The signature was there and not there, a smudge that still suggested an M. He had it in his hand, the tech said quietly, like he meant to carry it with him until it could be carried no further. No one spoke for a long breath. The hum of the lights took up the space. Words might have cluttered. Reed wrote something in his notebook and then closed it without looking. Linda touched the plastic with 2 fingers and thought of the girl's photograph. Pigtails and a smile that knew nothing of valves or seams or time counted in shallow breaths. Back at a workstation, a monitor showed a simple 3D model of the hull in profile. Ito walked them through the last hours, not as a film, but as an outline. They had launched at night when the swamp and the road both grow kinder to secrets. The hull took the water without a lurch because it had been built by hands that knew the balance between weight and buoyancy. The first miles were smooth, the engine a steady thrum their bodies trusted instinctively. The air inside was already wrong, too warm, too wet, but survivable. At some point, a pressure spike traveled the length of a joint like a rumor. The microfracture opened as if in relief. The air tasted different. Michael, older, heavier shouldered, would have turned to the panel and adjusted the mix, then adjusted again. The numbers didn't improve. Anthony felt it first in his chest, then his hands, as dexterity went ragged, as patience shortened. They kept moving because momentum felt like an answer. When the trickle began, it didn't look like an emergency, not at first. A shimmer along a seam, a bead recurring where no bead should be. They mopped it with a rag. It returned. The rag came away with a smell like pennies. Michael swore quietly, as if Emily could hear him from wherever his idea of safety lived, and dropped to one knee. Anthony angled the flashlight and breathed too fast. "Not yet. Not yet," Michael would have said, and meant both the water and the future. When the mix slipped a second time, panic wasn't a choice, it was a physics problem. They traded positions, Anthony to the hatch, Michael to the panel. The handle fought him. The warped lug decided for him. He pulled and slipped, pulled and slipped. Somewhere in that short, furious effort, the decision to leave a message formed whole, as if it had been sitting in him for months. He fumbled for whatever would write, a carpenter's pencil, sapped short. He pressed too hard and tore the paper slightly. He wrote anyway. "Forgive us. Tell Emily." By then the water had found a lower edge and remembered its job. It filled the places where breath should be. In the cramped light, their world shrank to a series of tasks. Hold the note, try the handle again, curse, pray, remember. The air thinned to a razor. Michael's hand shook but did not let go. Anthony's palm left those bright arcs on the handle that Ito had shown them, clean as daylight among the rust. They were still brothers. Even then. The model ended. The hangar did not move. Reed cleared his throat in a way that meant he was about to say something he would rather not have to say. "We ran Moreno," he said. "DEA archives confirm he went down in Laredo 2 years ago, shot during a raid. No extradition, no appeal, no interviews." Linda felt the floor shift under a truth she had expected, but had hoped to outrun. "So there's no one to charge," she said. "Not the man who recruited them," Reed said. He left the rest unsaid. Men like Moreno always answered to someone else, but even a ladder has to end somewhere, and theirs had ended in a morgue 2 states away. Keller folded his clipboard against his chest, as if that could soften it. "I'll finish the report for your file," he said. "Failure begins at the intake valve, cascades through the mix, ends at the hatch. There's competence in here, Officer Clark." He touched the ragged edge of a plate with something like respect. Also, haste. Also, fear. "Thank you," Linda said. The words felt insufficient, but they were the only currency that worked here. She and Reed stepped outside. Afternoon had settled into that Florida gray, where even shadows looked tired. The air smelled of old rain and the whisper of hot rubber from the highway beyond the fence. For a while they didn't speak. The hangar door rattled shut behind them, and the sound went up into the sky and did not come back. "So that's it," Reed said finally. "We write the ending. Independent smuggling attempt, mechanical failure, 2 deceased. We send a copy to the state's attorney. It goes into a drawer." Linda watched a line of ibis cross low white commas on a sentence no one had written for them. "It's an ending," she said, "just not the right one." Reed gave her the look he reserved for when she was about to turn an investigation into an obligation. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" She didn't smile. "The note belongs to Emily. Chain of custody. We'll do it by the book," she said, "but it belongs to her." He leaned back against the cinder block wall and rubbed the ridge of bone over his eye, as if the day sat there. "You'll find her?" "I'll find her," Linda said. The promise felt clean. It was the first thing all day that didn't wobble when she touched it. They drove back in a quiet that was not empty, but held. The Everglades lay to their west like a long, quiet ear. Linda's mind ran again along the path the engineers had drawn. Crack, taste, bead, note, handle. She kept catching on the same snag, the moment where a man chose to pick up a pencil instead of a wrench, because one more word made more sense than one more turn. At her desk that evening, she wrote the line the report would require. Apparent cause: intake valve failure leading to oxygen depletion and subsequent drowning. Secondary factor: hatch jam due to interior heat warping. She typed it and then stared at the cursor, a small blinking metronome timing out her hesitation. On the next line, she added something no form demanded. Note recovered indicates a primary concern for the pilot's daughter. She didn't name the daughter there. She didn't need to. She knew the name by feel now. Outside, the storm that had threatened all afternoon finally committed. Rain braided the window with silver. She took the sealed bag from the evidence locker, logged, countersigned, proper, and placed it in her field case with a care that felt like reverence. She imagined Rosa's living room, the picture frames, the thin thread of hope that had stitched the last decade together. She imagined a foster house outside Tampa, and a girl who had learned how not to ask certain questions out loud. When she locked the office, the hallway fluorescents buzzed like the hangars had. She thought of the hangar again. Parts on tables, names pinned to failures. There was a comfort in it, the way good analysis can soften a blow by telling you exactly where it lands. But some blows needed a different answer. Not a what or a how. A who and a why not. On the way home she detoured, without deciding to the water's edge. The night had not yet started in earnest. The sky had that open, uncommitted look that comes before true dark. Out across the flats, a thin ribbon of lighter horizon lingered like a promise someone had meant to keep. She stood with the case at her feet and let the swamp climb into her ears, the small, chittering lives, the long vowels of wind through grass. "Tomorrow," she said aloud, to the air or herself or the men she could no longer help. "Tomorrow, I'll take it to her." In her mind, the last hours unspooled one final time, but not as diagrams. Two brothers inside a room that shrank, making the choice to be human when the machine had already decided otherwise. The hatch had not given. The valve had lied. But a pencil had left a line that reached farther than steel. She picked up the case. Behind her, the marsh breathed out. Ahead, the road lifted, thin and black, toward a city where a letter would find its way home. The rain had stopped, leaving the air washed and heavy. The Everglades shimmered behind her, like a secret finally tired of hiding. Linda Clark stood beside her car in the weak morning light, the sealed evidence bag in her hands. Inside it, folded and water-stained, was Michael Delgado's final message. A few trembling lines that had outlasted both time and death. She had driven hundreds of miles over the past 2 days, through flat highways and small towns, until the map led her here. A quiet street outside Tampa, lined with oak trees and cracked sidewalks. The address from Rose's letter matched the house in front of her, modest and sun-faded, a swing hanging from the porch. Linda hesitated, looking down at the letter again. This was the moment she had replayed in her head 100 times, what it would feel like to bring back a voice from the dark. She took a breath, walked up the steps and knocked. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 40s, kind eyes, tired shoulders. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Hi," Linda said softly. "My name's Linda Clark. I'm with the Florida Wildlife Service. I came to see Emily Delgado." The woman blinked, cautious. "Emily's inside. I'm her guardian. Is something wrong?" "No," Linda said, her voice almost breaking. "Something's right." After a pause, the woman nodded and called over her shoulder. "Emily, honey, someone's here to see you." A few seconds later, a girl appeared in the doorway. Thin, quiet, 14 years old, her dark hair pulled into a loose braid. Her eyes met Linda's with the wary calm of someone who had grown used to silence. "Hi, Emily," Linda said gently. "I knew your father." The girl frowned. "My father's dead." "I know," Linda replied, "but he left something behind. Something for you." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the sealed bag. Inside, the letter looked fragile, like it might crumble if handled too roughly. Emily's eyes fixed on it. Linda handed it over with both hands. "This was with him when we found him," she said. "He wanted you to have it." Emily stared at it for a long time before opening the seal. The paper came apart slowly, as if waking from a long sleep. Her lips moved as she read, tracing every faded word. "If anyone finds this, forgive us. The engine failed. We tried to surface. Tell my daughter Emily I love her." Her fingers trembled. For a moment she said nothing, then whispered, "He said he loved me." Linda nodded. He did. He never stopped. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, quiet and unforced. She folded the note carefully and held it against her chest, as if afraid to let go. "No one ever told me what really happened," she said. Linda sat down beside her on the porch step. "Your father wasn't a bad man, Emily. He wasn't a criminal. He was a mechanic, a good one. He took a job that went wrong, but everything he did for you. He wanted you to be safe." The girl wiped her cheeks, her breath shaky but steadying. "Did he suffer?" she asked. Linda paused, choosing her words. He was brave. Until the very end. They sat there together in silence. The wind rustled the oak leaves, soft and slow, as if even nature knew to be quiet. The guardian watched from the doorway, her eyes shining with unspoken understanding. When it was time to leave, Emily stood and hugged Linda suddenly, tightly, like someone clinging to a memory. "Thank you," she whispered. Linda returned the embrace. "You're welcome, sweetheart." Driving back that afternoon, Linda felt lighter than she had in weeks. The sun broke through the clouds, flooding the sky with pale gold. The road curved toward the horizon, the wetlands stretching endlessly to her left. The same swamp that had hidden so much, now stripped of one more secret. A week later, Linda visited the federal storage hangar for the last time. The submarine sat under a gray tarp, motionless, forgotten by most. She walked around it slowly, tracing the curve of the rusted hull with her hand. "Rest now," she murmured. She wasn't sure who she was speaking to, the brothers, the swamp, or the story itself. But the words felt right. For the first time, the air inside the hangar didn't feel heavy. It felt still, peaceful. As she turned to leave, light slipped through a crack in the roof and touched the metal, glinting faintly. The same reflection that had first caught her eye in the swamp weeks ago. It flickered once, then vanished, like a final acknowledgement. Back at her desk that evening, Linda wrote the final line of her report. The Delgado case serves as a reminder that not every crime is born from greed. Sometimes it begins with love, desperation, and the belief that one last chance might change everything. She read the sentence twice, then signed her name beneath it. Outside, the Florida sunset stretched across the horizon, burning gold over the wetlands. The swamp would keep its mysteries, as it always did. But one story, the story of two brothers who tried to save their family, and the daughter who finally knew the truth, had been brought back into the light. That night, Linda stood on a wooden pier near her home, the water below smooth as glass. The air smelled of rain and river grass. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, distant now, almost gentle. She closed her eyes and whispered into the dusk. "Rest easy, boys. She knows." The wind stirred, carrying her words out across the dark water toward the Everglades. For a moment, the world felt perfectly still, as if the swamp itself was listening, at peace with the secret it had finally shared. And then the night folded around her, calm and complete, the echo of the water, the only sound left, soft, rhythmic, eternal. Some secrets are buried deep, not to hide guilt, but to protect love. The Everglades kept their silence for years, but the truth has finally surfaced. What would you have done in Michael's place? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.